Not sure that any of that came through. I may have been muted. Anyway, so I'm going to start over.
You were
This is
muted.
this is I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm director at UC Center Sacramento, and I want to welcome you all to the first speaker series event of this winter quarter. We're continuing with our theme of emerging from the pandemic, but obviously we're not emerging quite as rapidly as all of us had hoped and expected. But whether COVID finally passes on or just settles into endemicity, there's many public policy problems that are in need of informed discussion and debate, and the UCCS Speaker Series tries to provide the information needed to see these discussions productively. So one all too infrequent source of information is careful evaluation of public policies. Sometimes we just have to try things, but then the question is, did the program work as it was intended to? And today's talk will focus on the effects of rental eviction moratoria that were imposed at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Regarding questions, please hold them till the end when you can click on the raise hand icon and staff will call on you, or you can also type questions into the Q&A feature on Zoom and staff will read as time allows. I will not be introducing today's speaker. Instead, I have the pleasure of introducing Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, who I understand is related to the speaker. Aside from that connection, Assemblymember Gabriel was elected to represent the 45th Assembly District in 2018. He's chair of the Assembly Committee on Privacy and Consumer Protection and chair of the Select Committee on Jobs and Innovation in the San Fernando Valley. His legislative interests have included housing and homelessness, public education, climate change, gun safety, and protection of vulnerable communities, and he successfully ushered 9 bills into law already. Before being elected to the legislature, Mr. Gabriel worked as a constitutional rights and general litigation attorney, and as such, he was honored with a California Lawyer Attorney of the Year Award in 2018. And last, but certainly not least, he is a UC Berkeley alumnus. So Assemblymember Gabriel, it's an honor to have you with us, and we look forward to your introduction of today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz. Can you see me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And as you mentioned, it's special for me for a number of reasons. One, because of my great affection for the University of California, but also because of my great affection for our speaker today, who happens to be my father, Dr. Stuart Gabriel. He texted me last night and asked that I keep my introduction short and low key. And I'm going to do neither of those things because I am incredibly proud of him and everything he has done and the wonderful research that he has done throughout his career. So what I'm going to do is just give you, read a little bit of his biography and then editorialize a little bit. But Stuart A. Gabriel is currently a Distinguished University Professor of Finance and the Art and Realty Chair at the UCLA Anderson School of Management, also the director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. Previously served on the economic staff of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., where he was responsible for advising the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and has also been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. He has published more than 80 articles in economics and finance journals and serves on the editorial boards of 7 academic journals. He's focused his research on a lot of really important public policy issues throughout his career. The recipient of numerous research award and just last year received the very prestigious Quigley Medal from the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association, has testified before the US Congress and the state legislature, and has provided a policy advice to elected officials at the local, state, and federal levels. He's the past president of the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association, a fellow of the Homer Hoyt Institute for Advanced Real Estate Studies, and last year also received the Niedorf Decade Teaching Award from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Has done a lot of really interesting things, but among his most important distinctions are that he has 3 degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, and I know is very, very deeply proud of his affiliations with the university. I will add to all of that, I think in many ways my father is emblematic of what makes the University of California so special. I know from conversations with him that he was drawn to a career in economics because he was very interested as a young man in how to solve issues of poverty and how to solve issues of inequity, how to build a more just an equitable society and economy for all of us in the state of California. And so, certainly does research because the pursuit of knowledge in itself is important, but always with an eye towards how do we build a stronger and more inclusive and more just society. And has done some incredible things, both in his research and in the work that he has done in the community after the civil unrest in Los Angeles. Following everything that happened with Rodney King, really created a program to help educate developers from low-income communities, from communities of color, how to go back and do economic development in their communities. And there's a whole decade of people that have worked or a generation rather of people that have worked in Los Angeles, thanks to the programs that he provided to strengthen their communities. Now doing really important work on affordable housing in the Ziman Center and at UCLA, so that young folks who are graduating with their MBAs also have real firsthand experience in how to develop affordable housing and help solve our terrible housing crisis here in the state. So he's a wonderfully talented guy. He is an amazing dad, an amazing grandfather, has a pretty awesome mustache. And I feel so lucky to be his son and to be able to call on him for advice about issues before the housing committee and issues before the legislature. And he's just the best human being in the whole world. So it's such a treat for me to introduce a very, very talented academic and researcher, but also a wonderful human being, my dad, Dr. Stuart Gabriel.
Jesse, I'm a little speechless. I mean, I kind of asked you to please keep it low key, and I guess there are a few remaining minutes here for me to give the talk, but really those remarks were way too kind, way too generous, and it's people like me who have to thank you, and have to thank all your colleagues in the state legislature, and have to thank all of your staff and all of those on the Zoom call today for all of the work that you do each and every day down in the trenches and in the interests of the people of California and in the interests of strong evidence-based, factually based public policy for the betterment of our society. So we thank you and indeed everybody present for their work on society's behalf. Richard, I'd also like to thank you and members of your staff as well. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. And thank you for the extraordinary function that you provide in connecting science and science-based research and findings and social science, evidence-based finding to the state legislature, to policymakers, and for fomenting and facilitating this wonderful connection between clearly one of the world's top research universities and the formulation of policy by the state of California. So I'm very favorably inclined towards that function that you provide, Richard. I'm very pleased to participate in it. And again, I thank you for this opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that the protocol for this talk is that I will speak for a few minutes, and then I will very much welcome any question or any comment that you have about the work. That's the whole purpose today, to open it up and to provide for informal discussion and commentary. But let me provide a bit of an overview, and with no further ado. The title of the paper is called More Than Shelter, The Effects of Rental Eviction Moratorium on Household Well-Being. It's co-authored, as you see, with two colleagues. They're both colleagues in the Federal Reserve System, both with access to Federal Reserve data and the like. Xudong Han, who's at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and Nitsan Surilan, who's at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I guess one way to motivate the talk is to look at a simple chart with two economic time series. They're both well known. The green line is the unemployment rate from 2005 to the present. The orange line is the single family mortgage delinquency rate over the same period. And what you see, what immediately jumps out at you is the fact that these two lines co-vary. They move in tandem, they move up and down in tandem. You see the green line implodes and unemployment rates move up to 10% in the context of the global financial crisis, this being a crisis that emanated from housing markets, and you see this huge spurt in mortgage delinquency as well. You see that the two lines basically trend down over an extended period of time over the ensuing decade as we see healing relative to the global financial crisis in both labor markets and housing markets. And then the artifact that I wish to point out on this chart is the fact that the two lines disassociate. and disassociate and move in very opposite directions with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we see a jump in the unemployment rate to 15%. This associated with stay-at-home orders, with closure of the economy, with many workers who are out of work filing for unemployment and all the rest. And yet mortgage delinquency heads down, it heads south, it disassociates. And the question is why? And the answer with respect to why is that policymakers put into place mortgage forbearance. They basically disallowed foreclosure proceedings on those who are late or unable to make mortgage payments owing to pandemic-related distress. Those mortgage payments were simply tacked on to the end of the mortgage, and there was no spurt in delinquency, default, or foreclosure during this period. So we have evidence here of a policy that kept people in their homes, allowed people to shelter in place, allowed people to survive economically during a period of what we call exogenous shock, the shock that was associated with the pandemic. Now, if you turn then to rental markets, we don't have the same time series to demonstrate, but we can go to Google search and to a website called Google Trends, where we can look at search volume for various search terms. And here we put together search volume indices that relate to 3 different search terms that are intended to be indicative of concerns that renters have about inability to pay rent, about the opportunity for deferral of rent, and for concerns that relate to eviction, both preceding and subsequent to the pandemic. And what's notable here, just like in the prior chart, is that you see this huge uptick, if you will, in concern, in worry, whatever, that relates to potentiality for eviction, that relates to concerns about inability to pay rent with the onset of the pandemic, that attenuates to some extent thereafter, although we see high levels of concern about eviction that pertain subsequently. So we have a pandemic. The pandemic hits us in March of 2020. We have actions by government at every level. Government closes the economy, a truly unprecedented set of events. Millions of workers are told to stay home, to shelter in place. They're cut off from employment. They're in many cases, their income level falls drastically. They're idle. They're unable to pay rent. If they're a typical renter, they have very limited resources to pay that rent, and there's certainly a risk of eviction. And almost immediately, state and local governments stepped in, not the federal government. It took the federal government 6 months to do so, but state and local governments stepped in, even in March of 2020, and they enacted moratoria on rental eviction. Those moratoria on rental eviction came with an automatic rent deferral clause where rent wasn't forgiven, but it was deferred to some undetermined future date. And basically these eviction moratoria, including what Dr. Kravitz was talking about in terms of intended effect of policy, had two intended effects. One was to assure shelter of these idle households. In other words, households were not going to be put onto the street. We weren't going to create homelessness during this period of high transmission of a virus that we didn't understand. And secondarily, these moratoria allowed people to shelter in place. And in so doing, they were intended to be efficacious in terms of the damping of pandemic virus spread. But when you look to Dr. Kravitz's world, the director of the UC Sacramento Center, Dr. Kravitz is a medical doctor. He knows a lot about surgery. And as you all know, you can do orthoscopic, laser-based surgery, surgery that's guided, that's precision, that's exact. Or in other cases, and Dr. Kravitz doesn't recommend this, you can do surgery with a chainsaw. And the reason that I bring this up is that eviction moratoria were kind of like surgery with a chainsaw. This was an unprecedented, profound interruption into the operation of rental markets. We basically told landlords they couldn't collect rent and they couldn't evict tenants. And yet these landlords are intended to survive, and they're intended to pay their own mortgages, and they're intended to invest in rental housing and provide shelter for renters. So this was a policy that was very significant, that was very profound, and that had essentially no policy precedent. And we know a little bit about the direct intended effects of the policy. That's something that I spoke of a moment ago. The policy reduced eviction filings, so the policy had the exact intended effect. And the policy has also been shown by a number of public health researchers, including researchers here at UCLA. The eviction moratoria actually did succeed in statistically damping the spread of the COVID-19 virus. What we ask about in this paper is a question that we ask in the case of policy evaluation very, very often, which is a question about the inadvertent, indirect, unintended effects of public policy, of legislation. What else did it do? How did it surprise us? And how did it surprise us to the good or to the bad? And what lessons can we collect and learn from that? And one of the sets of surprises that we're interested in, or the connections that we're interested in making, have to do with potential connectivity, even what I'd call causal effects of the policy as relate to other phenomena that we were witnessing in the US exactly in that time frame. And those phenomena included unprecedented high levels of food insecurity, households in the US that didn't have enough food to eat, and also very significant rises in survey-based evidence of mental distress, of anxiety, and other symptoms of mental disorder. In other words, there are a lot of things going on at once, and we are going to try in this paper to establish not correlation, but causality. That is a causal relationship between the eviction moratorium and some of these other outcomes. Now, if you look, as someone in my shoes typically would, to precedent in research literature, that is prior research studies, and what these studies tell us about an event such as the event we have here, well, we have here what economists call a liquidity shock. That liquidity shock is in the form of rent deferral. It's all of a sudden, one day there's a decree, and the decree is, by the way, you can stay in your place and you don't have to pay rent. And we'll get back to you as to when you need to pay that rent back. So that, we call that a liquidity shock. This means that there's liquidity, and the question is, what does a household do with the liquidity? And basically, the household could do one or two things with that liquidity. Household can either save the funds that ordinarily would have gone to rent, and we have various evidence from the early period of the pandemic that the savings rate shot up to 32%, unprecedented in April of 2020. We also have evidence from JP Morgan Chase that shows that many households raised cash reserves during the pandemic. So part of the supply chain issues and the opening of the economy right now has to do with the fact that a lot of consumption was deferred, so people saved. But on the other hand, we have lots of studies that say when there is an unexpected, unpredicted liquidity shock, and it's positive, that households are going to go out and they're going to spend some of that money, maybe a whole bunch of that money. So if it's a bequest, or if it's a stimulus check from the government, or whatever it happens to be, a lot of that money is going to be spent. And in fact, if it's a stimulus check, the intention of the policy is that money be spent. So the question is, this rent deferral, what sort of impact did it have on consumption spending? Now, getting to the other two outcomes that we're looking at, food insecurity and mental health effects, why are we looking at these outcomes? Well, in both cases, we see very significant anecdotal report and survey evidence of glaring difficulties during the early stages of the pandemic in both of these arenas. So you, like I, probably were watching the evening news during these early days of the pandemic. And what seared into my mind and really, really hit me were miles and miles of cars stretched outside an enormous facility like the Indy 500 racetrack, only waiting hour upon hour to receive 2 bags of groceries in their trunk. In other words, very graphic anecdotal and survey-based evidence of hunger in America, of food insecurity in America. And secondarily, a lot of similar reports that had to do not only with a pandemic and the coronavirus, but also an epidemic, so to speak, here in the United States that related to adverse mental health issues. So we want to link those outcomes to see if there is any link in those outcomes, to see if there's a causal link between those outcomes. And again, we don't know anything about eviction moratoria because they're unprecedented as a policy tool. What we do know something about is eviction. And people have studied eviction in the past, and we do know that the act of eviction can be very adverse in terms of employment outcomes, in terms of homelessness, in terms of physical health, in terms of housing stability, in terms of mental health. And we have a whole literature in public health that relates to those particular outcomes. So what do we do in the study that we do here? Well, the first thing we do is we invent data. Now, what's that mean to invent data? What it means is the fact that eviction moratoria, being completely unprecedented, have no track record of data collection. I can't go to a standard data source and dial in eviction moratoria and download the data. No such thing exists. So we have to assemble a new data set here that relates to both what we call the cross-section, that is cross-county, cross-state incidents of eviction moratoria, and also the time frame of that cross-sectional incident. So that's why we call it a panel data set. Once we have that data in place, and once we code that data, we're going to be able to seek to link that eviction moratoria data to other outcome terms, those outcome terms related to food and grocery spending, to food insecurity, and to mental health. Now, you hear oftentimes in a presentation such as the one that I'm making today about related literature, and you know that researchers get very involved in related literature, and sort of, why are we doing this? Well, I guess the answer is that each study is a little chink in the eye sculpture. Each study provides a bit of evidence-based finding and research, and if you can integrate and amalgamate those studies, you can discern the full eye sculpture, you can discern the full picture, you can put the pieces of the puzzle together, and you can get to conceptualization and conclusion as relates to the direction of policy. So as I said, we have a literature that relates to eviction, not to eviction moratoria, but to eviction and to adverse effects of eviction. I won't repeat what I said there. We have few papers that relate to eviction moratoria, very recent. And again, those relate to eviction filings and spread of the virus, as I spoke about earlier. We have papers, a vast literature in urban economics and other fields that relate to functions of the rental market interventions. I did some work that related to moratoria, not as relate to rental eviction, but as relates to foreclosure a number of years ago. In fact, I was up here in Sacramento speaking about that research a number of years ago, where we saw that the California foreclosure prevention laws were stabilizing with respect to local housing markets in California in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Won't go into that here. And of course, we have a vast number of papers. I just attended virtually the American Economics Association annual meetings, a vast amount of research on the COVID-19 pandemic and the economy. Let me give you a preview of what I'm going to show you momentarily. The first thing we do, as I said, is we compile the data. And once we compile the data, we are able to demonstrate, and to demonstrate again causally, that these eviction moratoria provided broad indirect benefits to households during this emergent period of pandemic distress. Those benefits were in the form of household non-durable spending. So in other words, households were able to redirect the scarce funds that were set aside for rent into non-durable consumption, into food service and grocery spending. And we see even more pronounced beneficial effects of eviction moratoria on food and grocery spending in what we call vulnerable neighborhoods and amongst vulnerable populations. I'll get more into that momentarily. And then we are, again, able to establish an indirect causal relationship between eviction moratoria and food insecurity, as well as mental stress. I'll show you that momentarily. So the eviction moratoria were beneficial with respect to both of those outcomes, with effects more pronounced when we stratify the analysis by race, more pronounced beneficial effects amongst African-American households. Now, okay, that having been said, let's go back. Let's talk a little bit about background. Let's talk a little bit about data and method and get you to the precision of the results here. Once we do that, we'll open it up and be happy to take all your questions. So we have onset of pandemic in March of 2020. And immediately, according to survey research, we see that full 1/2 of all renters in the United States become severely affordability constrained. What's severely affordability constrained mean? It means that these renters are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. Now, if you go to a survey that the Fed does on a longstanding basis regularly, it's called the Survey of Consumer Finances, you ask a simple question. What's the net worth of an average renter? What's the net worth of an average homeowner? The net worth of an average renter is a mere $5,000. The net worth of an owner, if I'm saying this correctly, is $250,000. So owners $250,000, renters $5,000. That means there's no financial wherewithal on the part of renters. And that means that the lease breeze can be very concerning with respect to the renter population. So in that particular context, with pandemic onset, 38 states in the US, including the big states, California, Florida, Texas, New York, immediately enacted eviction moratoria. That spread to other states later. And again, the idea here is does the liquidity associated with rent deferral, does the eviction moratoria allow that liquidity to be redirected to other immediate household consumption needs, notably including food needs, so as to ease food insecurity and mental stress? How do we develop this data set? Well, again, given that there is no cross-section in time series of eviction moratoria, we have to put the data together adroitly, quickly, efficiently, and all the rest. And we do what is done in modern research today, and that is we use programs, and these are very articulated new programs in the larger world of data analytics to undertake textual analysis. What's that mean? That means that we do an automated search at the state level of the websites of every governor's office, every court, every legislature, and we look for text that relates to eviction moratoria. We look for the start date or the end date if there is text about enactment of eviction moratoria. And in this particular way, through this automated textual search, we're able to put together a data set that relates to the time frame and the geographic incidence of eviction moratoria. Now, indeed, we need a technical definition of eviction moratoria, and that's in this next bullet point here. This includes moratoria on landlord notice of eviction to the tenant, moratoria on landlord eviction filing, and initiation of judicial lawsuit against the tenant, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the technical definition of what indeed is an eviction moratorium. Our study period is a 6-month period between onset of the pandemic and the end of August 2020. Why does it end there? It ends there because on September 1 of 2020, the CDC issues a national eviction moratorium. And that moratorium lasts all the way through October of 2021, when it was not further upheld by the US Supreme Court. So basically a year running, but the 6-month period prior to the national moratorium gives us enough variability in time and place in order to conduct our statistical analysis. And what we do is we code our text-based search of eviction moratoria into what we call dynamic maps. What are dynamic maps? They're maps that move weekly, that turn on and off and show you the exact geographic incidence of these eviction moratoria. So rather than weekly maps, and you can go, by the way, to the UCLA website at the UCLA Simon Center for Real Estate and take a look at those maps. You can do that right now if you want. But basically, I take 3 of those maps where early on, you can see in March 8th of 2020, very little in the way of eviction moratoria. By May 3rd of that year, the colored states are states where we have some version of eviction moratoria in place. And by the time we get to the end of August, the end of the sample period, states are already turning off in the sense that you see a lot more white in the map. Those are places that no longer have eviction moratoria in place. So if I were to show you these maps in a dynamic weekly context, you would get the picture of how these eviction moratoria turn on and off over time. We can do the very same thing at the county level. Now, the county level, again, you see here for 3 points in time for all counties in the US, and you see a curiosity here. And the curiosity is the blue. And the blue are counties that enact eviction moratoria in states that have already enacted eviction moratoria. And in fact, I called Jesse at one point when I was doing this, and I said, Jesse, can you help me? Can you explain to me why counties are enacting eviction moratoria in states that had already done so, seemingly completely redundant? We talked about it a little bit. I did some further digging here, and I'm not sure if we have all the answers here, but one reason that counties enacted such moratoria is that if the moratoria was at the county level, it gave the county the right of enforcement of that moratorium. That allowed county level sheriff or whoever it was to enforce the moratoria, as well as authorities at the state level. There are also political pressures and political incentives to put these moratoria into place, and also sometimes the timeframes between counties and states didn't match. But regardless, we have coded this information weekly at the county level in addition to the state level. Now, what other data do we bring here? We need data on outcome terms. We need data on controls. So the outcome terms come largely from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has a phenomenal data set, basically on credit card purchases, payments, credit scores, other borrower characteristics, et cetera, that consists of 50 billion records for 500 million credit card accounts that is utilized for the bank stress testing activity that the Federal Reserve Board does. We brought that data set on board. That's a proprietary Federal Reserve data set. We have a similar data set organized by an individual by the name of Raj Chetty, and that data set has the further advantage of disaggregating spending into categories. So we can look at categories like food service spending. We have a third data set that we bring forward, which is a special weekly survey undertaken by the US Bureau of the Census in the wake of the onset of COVID-19, starting in April 23rd and moving forward, which asked a myriad of questions, including questions about food security, including questions about household mental health and the like. And then on top of that, we did our own Google search and our own Google search query, and basically put into place all kinds of search volume indicators as relates to food insecurity. I'm going to go light on the next part. The next part relates to the statistical models that we use to establish causality. Now, just bear in mind, if you'll permit me here, causality is the name of the game in scientific research. It's very easy to establish correlation between two variables, but we have no insight whatsoever as to what that correlation means or what the causal directions or effects are that are embedded in that correlation. So if I want to tell you a story and I want you to believe my story, I have to statistically establish a causal relationship. I need adequate controls. I need everything to match up. And this is kind of what this slide is about. I also need to know, when I tell you a causal story, that causality goes from eviction moratoria to food insecurity and not from food insecurity to eviction moratoria. And we have other ways of manipulating the data to assure the direction of the causal story. One of the things we did here, by the way, is we sought to explain why states and counties at particular points in time imposed eviction moratoria. We found that one of the primary drivers of a statistical explanation of the incidence of eviction moratoria was state political ideology, as proxied by vote shares between Republicans and Democrats in the 2016 election. We also, as a way of identifying effects, not only look for the effects of eviction moratoria on, for example, food service spending, but we look to see whether those effects are more pronounced. In particular, neighborhoods that are more vulnerable, neighborhoods with higher renter shares or higher unemployment shares, whatever. We call this a treatment intensity analysis. So we're going to do that as well. Now, the first thing we do here statistically is what we sort of call a data sanity check. And what does that exactly mean? It means that if this web scraping and text parsing exercise that we do using big time data analytics and lots of RAs and all the rest of it, brings us an accurate picture of the distribution of eviction moratoria, that those eviction moratoria should be able to explain the geographic and timing incidence of declines in eviction filings. In other words, this is just a very basic relationship. It's not really the purpose of the paper, but it is, does our data on eviction moratoria work? Does it explain eviction filings? We did that analysis and the answer is yes. And so that gave us the confidence to go forward. Now, we, for example, took a look at that question both at the state level and at the local level. And we find, by the way, and we can talk about this more in discussion if you want, that the local ordinances really did not have salient effects on consumption spending, on food insecurity, on mental health, et cetera, beyond those that were evidenced in the state level data. Okay, this is what some of the statistical results look like, but I'm not going to spend our time there. I'm going to skip forward to the interpretation of those results. And let me give you one version of the interpretation. If we're looking at the credit card spending and credit account pay down and all the rest in the Federal Reserve data, we find that, for example, if an eviction moratorium is enacted, if it lasts 12 months, it's going to be associated with a 16% increase in credit card spending. So in other words, the enactment of eviction moratoria, the deferral of rental payments does have a statistically significant and what we call economically material or salient effect on spending and in the direction that we would anticipate. So there is some spending relief that comes from this rent deferral. The next thing we do is we ask, can we corroborate that in an entirely different data set, this data set that comes from Chetty? And the answer is yes, we do corroborate. We corroborate in terms of both direction of effect, that we have this causal effect between eviction moratoria and spending. And we also produce what we call an economically salient effect. So again, you can have a statistically significant effect that doesn't make any difference because it's not very big. So we have to ask both questions. Is it significant statistically, and is it big enough to make a difference? And the answer in our case is yes to both. Okay, from there, we take advantage of the Chetty data in the sense that we have spending by category of spending. So we can look at food service spending, on retail spending, and on non-durable spending. And in all cases, we get a statistically significant causal, economically salient and meaningful effect of the eviction moratoria in redirecting scarce resources that would have gone into rent into food spending. And so the numbers you see here, 1%, 1.4%, that's per week of eviction moratoria. So multiply that by half a year by 25 weeks or 26 weeks or whatever, and you're going to get to a 26% increment in food service spending associated with a half-year eviction moratoria. So that's what we call a economically significant effect. Again, the tables that pertain there too. Now, we wanted to further corroborate those results, and we further corroborate those results in two different ways. One is to go to this COVID-19 Bureau of Census Emergency Weekly Household Pulse Survey starting on April 23rd. And one of the survey questions was asking households to self-declare whether in the prior 7 days they had enough food to eat or often did not have enough food to eat. And anyone who self-declared that they sometimes did not have enough food to eat or often did not have enough food to eat would be categorized as food insecure. We want to look to whether the time frame and the geographic incidence of eviction moratoria serve to reduce self-reporting of food insecurity. And the answer to that question was, again, yes. We identify this significant causal relationship. It's salient, and it's most pronounced for African-American households who declare themselves as food insecure. And one final corroboration here, we go to Google search query, and we seek to see query volume, what we call a search volume index in the Google Trends website, the SVI, as relate to certain search terms that we think are indicative of households who are food insecure, who are looking for ways to relieve that food insecurity. So we look for search query volume related to food stamps, the search term food stamps, and for another search term called food banks near me. We're presuming that you'd be searching for food banks near me if you wanted to avail yourself to food availability at such food banks. And again, we get a similar sort of response with statistically significant, economically salient, positive impact of eviction moratoria on reductions in search for food stamps, for food banks near me, and the like. So we have a whole set of evidence here, going from the Federal Reserve data to like data sets to data sets that look at spending by type of spending, to survey-based research from the Census Pulse survey, to Google-based search query evidence, and they all speak to the fact that eviction moratoria were helpful with respect to food insecurity. One other piece of the paper here that relates to mental health. Pre-pandemic, based on census survey information, 1 in 10 adults in the United States reported that they were plagued by symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder. In the immediate aftermath of the onset of the pandemic, that share from 10% jumped to 40%, an astounding jump in self-reporting of symptoms of anxiety or mental distress. Clearly, fear of eviction could have contributed to the elevated anxiety, to the deterioration of mental health. And clearly, those symptoms could have been relieved by a CDC or a state of California, which said, you know what, we're not going to evict you at your home at this time. You're safe with that roof over your head, shelter in place. We'll figure out the rent at a different time. So we went to the Census Pulse survey, and we identified 3 questions that were actually put into the survey by the National Institute of Mental Health that relate to the frequency on a weekly basis with which households felt nervous, anxious, on edge, frequency with which they were not able to control worrying, or frequency of feeling down, depressed, hopeless, and the like. And on that basis, we characterize households in terms of their level of mental distress. And we look to see statistically whether the cross-section and the time series of eviction moratoria were associated with reduction in self-reporting of those symptoms. And again, we get a similar result, a statistically significant and economically salient reduction in self-reporting of symptoms of mental distress, survey-based, in areas where we enacted eviction moratoria. So let me just conclude here, and not exactly sure I'm at time-wise. I hope you haven't taken too much time, with a little bit of conclusion, a little bit of discussion, and then I'll look forward to your commentary. So I've talked about how we put the new data set into place, and I've talked about how this measure of geographic and temporal incidence of eviction moratoria is associated with a reduction in food insecurity, improvements in mental health. We've talked about the fact that the effects are more pronounced in vulnerable neighborhoods. And we've talked about the fact that the effects regarding food insecurity and mental stress are also more pronounced amongst African-American households. Where do we stand today? Well, as you know, as of October 3rd, based on discussion at the Supreme Court, we saw expiration of the eviction moratorium, the federal eviction moratorium, after it being in place for in excess of a year. There's still millions of households that are at risk of eviction. And yet, if you look at the most recent data, and this data comes from the Princeton Eviction Lab, you find that between October and end of year, which was literally 2 weeks ago, we saw lower levels of eviction filing than we anticipated. Now, why might that be the case? Well, there are a couple of thoughts here. One is that there was substantial funds in 2 rounds of federal stimulus, essentially $47 billion in funds that were intended to be directed to emergency rental assistance funds. In other words, to make landlords roughly whole on back rent owed by tenants that were adversely affected by the pandemic. So those funds perhaps were finally distributed in a substantial manner. We also know that it was illegal to evict tenants while they were receiving emergency rental assistance. So that's kind of the good news, we believe. But on the other hand, as I believe Dr. Kravitz said at the initiation of this session, we still have a virus. The virus is not to date associated with government-imposed economic closure, but it is associated with economic closure, which is organic, which is coming from the fact that literally millions of workers are unable to show up to work, either because of being affected by the virus or being in some sort of quarantine or being concerned about the virus or whatever. And so we have economic outcomes where vulnerable, public serving, public facing renter population workers are now without income support, without stimulus, without eviction moratoria. So I'm not sure this story is over. And clearly, to all of you who work with the state legislature, this is an opportunity for an ongoing conversation about the humanity of our treatment of vulnerable renter populations in the context of a severe dislocation that was not of their doing. So with that, I'll stop and I'll open it up, and I thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Gabriel, for just a fantastic talk today. And I'm just going to give Brooke just a sec here to go ahead and stop our recording.